Counting is one of the first things we learn in a foreign language, yet mastering it takes time. While basic numbers may seem simple, using them effectively in communication requires much more than just memorizing words. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we're going to talk about counting in Chinese, and as we shall see, this is something which is relevant not just for beginners, but also for more advanced students. This is a good reminder that learning a language is not like learning other subjects. When we learn world geography in school, it's fine to study the countries and geographical features of, say, South America, and once you're done with that, you can move on to Central America and then North America. Your ability to understand and learn where the Rocky Mountains are is not directly influenced by whether or not you remember where the Andes are, after all. In contrast, when learning Mandarin and other languages, we do need to constantly refer back to things we learned previously, and we're never really done with anything. As a student, you can't really say, oh, we studied vocabulary for going to a restaurant last week, so this week I don't need it. And if you sit an exam covering Book 2 in a series, you shouldn't be surprised if words from Book 1 also appear on the test, because of course these more common words will recur over and over, and there's no getting away from them. The more basic the words, the more frequently they are used in the language, and the more you will need to rely on them to make sense of things you learn later and to be able to communicate. Most students think they learn to count in the first week of class, but I have encountered many intermediate students that actually cannot count in Chinese, even though they've been learning for a year or two. I don't mean that they can't count from 1 to 10, I mean that they can't use numbers proficiently for communicative purposes, and that is, after all, why most people are learning a language. So if you can't do that, I don't think it counts as really being able to count. So in this episode, I want to discuss counting in Chinese, and we will start with the beginners, what do beginners typically learn, and what the problem is with this approach, and then we will move on to some challenges specific to Chinese that more advanced students also need to learn to deal with. So let's start by focusing on basic numbers. These are important to learn early on for a number of reasons. There are few things you can say without numbers, and there are a lot of things you can say as a beginner with numbers. There are two main problems students face when learning numbers, and the first is a matter of sequence, and the second is a matter of fluency. Let's start by talking about sequencing. There is a lot of research into vocabulary acquisition, and one thing that has been found over and over is that if you learn something in a specific context, it is also easier to recall in that specific context. This is true for numbers as well, so if you've learned to count from 1 to 10 in Chinese, and you know that qi means 7 and ba means 8, it is much easier to come up with that ba if you say qi first. Let's use the difficulty of two tasks to illustrate this point. Most beginners can, after the first week, recite the numbers from 1 to 10 in order. This is not a problem. They can also easily follow along when somebody else counts from 1 to 10. However, they will struggle to understand a number that is not given in sequence. So this could, for example, be a page number in the book their teacher wants them to turn to, or it could be a phone number, or it could be the time of day at which they're supposed to meet next time, or something like that. When speaking themselves, they will also struggle to come up with numbers out of sequence. So for example, if they're supposed to say Monday, October the 21st, they will need to maybe count upwards to get to 21 before they know how to say it. This leads us to the second problem, which is one of fluency, and fluency here is defined as how good you are at things you already know. And as we all know, when speaking a language, it is not enough to just know something theoretically or given enough time. It is necessary to recall things very quickly and be able to do so effortlessly for a conversation to be possible. Naturally, you don't need to be able to recall everything instantly, but if you need to think about things like basic numbers, it is likely that you won't be able to recall things quickly enough to have a meaningful conversation, either because you yourself get frustrated because it takes too long, or because the person who's listening runs out of patience. This is what I meant earlier when I said that I've met intermediate students who still struggle with numbers. They haven't really used numbers for communicative purposes, either when it comes to their own speaking, so conveying information that contains numbers and where the numbers are meaningful and important, or listen to other people when it is important to understand what they're saying. They've just treated these words as if they were names of geographical features on a world geography exam, something you can learn and then put aside. If this is in a formal educational setting, this probably says more about the teacher than the student though, but the result still is that the students can't use numbers. To check how closely your knowledge of numbers is tied to a sequence, you can try mixing it up a bit. For example, can you count down from 100? Can you count up but only counting odd numbers, or maybe only even numbers? You can also try random or arbitrary numbers, such as phone numbers, where there is no connection between one number and the next. The problem here is that the focus when learning numbers has been purely on form, how they are pronounced and maybe how they are written, what they sound like, and so on, not what they mean. The best way to learn numbers in Chinese, and indeed any other words, is embedded in a communicative context. If, for example, every class begins with a quick chat about the current date and time, you'll pick up those numbers in no time. And if you have a tutor or you have a language exchange partner, you talk about when to meet next time and you compare calendars in Chinese, you will also learn to use these numbers very quickly. This is because you are no longer treating the numbers as pure form. It's not just about sounds or if you've written them down lines on a sheet of paper, but about what these things signify in the real world. If you have to use Chinese to find a time when you can meet next time, you have to say things like 3 p.m., 4 p.m., 5 p.m., next Tuesday, next Wednesday, and so on, and you will have to understand when the other person says when they have or don't have time to meet you. And so all these numbers are connected to something real that you need to communicate with this person about. If you practice numbers in this way, you will learn very quickly and you will not be dependent on a specific sequence, because that is of course irrelevant when talking about when to meet. So for all the beginners out there, stop caring too much about language forms, that's the pronunciation and the writing, and start caring more about what these things mean and what you can communicate using these words. Let's move on and leave the basic numbers and pure beginners and talk a little bit about larger numbers that can cause trouble even for advanced students. There are several reasons that large numbers in Chinese can be a little bit tricky, and some of them are related to the way the Chinese language is structured compared to English, and others are connected more to how we practice and are a little bit similar to what I talked about for the beginner students just now. Just to mention a few examples of where Chinese is different from English, in numbers like 101, you need to remember that in Chinese the 0 has to be pronounced, so 101 in Chinese is 101, so you pronounce the ling here, the 0 in the middle. If you were to say it like we do in English and just say 100, this actually is short for 110 in Chinese, not 101. Another peculiarity of Chinese is that you also need to specify the number of tens even when there is only one. So for example, when saying 110 in Chinese, this is 110, so you have to say 10, you cannot just say 10 here. These are not too tricky to learn to understand, but they can take a while before you get used to when you speak yourself. Something that is a lot harder to master is numbers from 10,000 and up. The problem here is that in English we switch words every 3 zeros, but in Chinese we switch every 4. This means that 10,000 has its own word in Chinese, 1, and 100,000 is then 10,000, so 10,000. And million is then by 1, so 110,000. When you encounter this the first time, you might say, oh, that's not how I'm used to doing it. But what you won't realize is that even if you study Chinese for a decade, you will still mess this up sometimes, and it's incredibly hard to really internalize a different way of dealing with these large numbers. In essence, the problem is the same as for the beginners we talked about earlier in this episode, namely that the numbers are arbitrary and abstract. They don't mean anything, you learn them purely as form, and they have no connection to anything meaningful that goes on in the world. And when you communicate, you don't actually need to make sense of these words. It's often enough to know that it's a large number or that the apartment was very expensive, but exactly how expensive it is or how large the number is seldom relevant for understanding the gist or for understanding what someone is talking about. So we're rarely required in everyday life to parse very large numbers. A strategy that I've found very useful to get around this problem is to anchor the numbers in something that is meaningful to you and use that as a reference point. For example, if you live in China or Sweden or many other countries which happen to have currencies that are worth roughly as much and have salaries on a comparable level, monthly salaries are usually in the 1 range. This means that if you're talking about salaries in Chinese, you will quickly learn what 1 means. You will have an intuitive reference for it because you've used it in a meaningful context many times. You can then expand this to yearly salaries, which would then be in the 10 range. And then if you're buying an apartment or house, this is probably in the by 1 range. This means that these numbers are no longer very abstract for you, and it will be much easier to parse them. Like I said, you might need to change the examples depending on where you live. So if you're an American, for example, you can't use these examples because the dollar is worth a lot more than the Swedish crown or the Chinese yuan. Instead, you might think of new cars as being in the 1 range, and this is in US dollars then. You can think of the price of an apartment or house as in the 10 range, and then maybe the population of the biggest cities in the US as being in the by 1 range. For even bigger numbers, I prefer to switch to populations of countries. So a smallish country like Sweden has a population in the 10 range, so that's 10 million. If we want to talk about the population of bigger countries, such as the US, we can no longer use 10 and we need to come up with a new word because we can't say 1, and instead we say E, so that's 100 million. So more populous countries have populations in the E range. Then when we get to the biggest countries, that means China and India, we then have populations in the 10 range, so that would be billion in English. And if you want to include everybody on the planet sometime later this century, we can use by E, so that would be 10 billion. So far so good. We usually don't need to talk about populations bigger than that, but there are of course areas where we need even bigger numbers. In finance and economics, for example, we might want to talk about the market capitalization of companies, and these might be in the 10 range for big companies, so that's hundreds of billions. So what about the really big companies like Apple? They have a market capitalization of over $1 trillion, so how do we say that in Chinese? You might expect there to be a new word here, because 10 is 100 billion, and we can't say 1 because then we have 4 zeros, so it should be a new word, and that word is zhao. Except this word isn't usually used for talking about the values of companies, and people actually use 1 which kind of violates the rule we talked about earlier. Zhao is not wrong, it's just that people use 1 anyway, and my guess is that this is because it's easier to compare numbers, because when you go from 999 billion to 1 trillion, you just change one word instead of both. It's worth noting though that in scientific and academic contexts, zhao is still used and it can mean trillion in general, so it's not wrong to use it. So why did I bring all this up? Well, I wanted to show that learning large numbers in Chinese is not easy. I've been learning Chinese for 17 years now, and I'm still significantly worse at saying numbers in Chinese compared to English. To illustrate, I ran a small unscientific experiment with one participant, myself, where I tried to say large numbers in Chinese as quickly as I could, while still being correct. If you want to try this yourself, you can find the numbers in the written article on Hacking Chinese. Reading all these numbers in Chinese correctly took me 42 seconds, and then, just to check, I tried this in Swedish and English, which took 15 and 16 seconds respectively. In other words, I was almost 3 times slower in Chinese, and that is because I need to check the number of zeros and make sure I get it right before I say the really large numbers. Naturally, in real life, you're very rarely called upon to say 6,836,238,955 in Chinese, but having to think a few seconds before coming up with how to say 6 billion can actually be a problem. Or indeed, if you need a lot of time to parse these numbers if other people mention them when, say, talking about the valuations of companies. Now that we have talked about the really big numbers, it's time to talk about the small numbers, which can also be tricky. The problem here is that fractions in Chinese are said in the reverse order compared to English, and this is very easy to learn theoretically, but extremely hard to do correctly in practice. So in case you're new to this, 1/4 in Chinese is 1/4, so the denominator 4 comes first and the numerator 1 comes last, but in English then we say 1/4. This is used for percentages as well, so 百分之八 is 8% or 8/100ths, whereas in English then we say 8 first and then 100, and in Chinese we do the opposite. I didn't conduct a mini experiment here, but in my experience this is significantly easier to deal with than the large numbers, but I still catch myself saying something the wrong way in Chinese. Before wrapping this episode up, I want to say a few more things about understanding Chinese numbers in context when other people are talking, so not when producing these numbers yourself, but when you're listening. As I said earlier, it's often the case that when we listen to Chinese, we're seldom held accountable and we don't really need to understand all the numbers we hear. And recall I said that it's enough to know that a house was expensive or that somebody's salary is high. We don't really need to know exactly how high it was. Unless, of course, if it's a house we are buying or if it's our own salary, then we care a lot and maybe talk about these things in Chinese and then we will learn. But most of the time when we listen to podcasts and TV shows and so on, understanding the gist is usually enough. I'm a big advocate of extensive listening in general, and most of the time it's simply not relevant and you don't need to know exactly what number somebody says, and your brain is a little bit lazy or efficient and chooses to simply ignore this and just notes it down as a big number. I've noticed that this happens with small numbers too though, so it's not only about zeros being put in groups of 4. To see how quickly I was able to parse basic numbers in Chinese, I conducted another mini experiment. I asked a native speaker to read 16 randomly generated phone numbers to me in Chinese, one digit at a time, and I tried to write them down. We tried this several times with different numbers to see what the maximum rate of speech was, where I could still write down all the digits correctly. We then did this in English as well to make sure that writing speed is not an issue, because it's one thing to parse what someone says and another thing to then also have to write down the digits on a paper. So how quickly could the person speak while I was still able to write down all the 11 digits of the phone number accurately then? Well, in English this was pretty fast, 3 seconds. But in Chinese it was twice as long, 6 seconds. I find this rather interesting because I've spoken Chinese for thousands and thousands of hours, significantly more than I've spoken English. I mean, after all, I've lived in Taiwan for 4 years and I've spoken Chinese daily for over a decade since then, but English is something I've only ever used for studies and work. Still, my ability to write down phone numbers is twice as good in English. And just to make this clear, I wrote down the Arabic numerals each time. I did not write Chinese characters. I think the main reason I'm so much slower in Chinese is that I haven't been in situations where transmitting or receiving numbers orally has been very important. In contrast, I have studied mathematics and physics in high school in English, and then of course you have to say and hear other people say numbers all the time. These numbers are also important. You can't just hear 768 but actually think it's just a large number. You need to know the exact number. You might even need to write it down and work with it. As I've been trying to say in this episode, numbers will be hard to master if they are only big things or small things or something like that, something abstract and a bit arbitrary and without any real meaning. But if you are in contexts where these things matter, you will learn them quickly enough. This doesn't mean that you need to be a physicist or a real estate broker to learn numbers properly, but you do need to make sure that you practice in a meaningful way so that these numbers have some bearing on reality, that they are not just a noise or a symbol on a page, that they actually mean something to you. As mentioned earlier in this episode, this is not just true for numbers, it's true for language in general. It's just that numbers tend to be more abstract and a bit arbitrary by nature, and it's maybe easier to forget this connection with reality and with meaning. To conclude this episode, counting really does count. If you are a beginner, embed numbers in a meaningful context and communicate where numbers actually mean something to you. And if you're an intermediate or advanced student, it's important to realize that numbers is not just something for beginners. If you really want to learn to deal with very large or small numbers, you need to also embed them in meaningful contexts. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at HackingChinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.